Okay, folks, this is a plenary presentation in the International Psychohistorical Association Conference, 2024 conference. It's going to be entitled Untruth and Totalitarianism. The presenter is Sheldon Solomon, PhD, who is an American social psychologist. He is a professor of psychology at Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York. His studies of the effects of the uniquely human awareness of death on behavior have been supported by the National Science Foundation and Ernest Becker Foundation and were featured in the award-winning documentary film, Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. He is the co-author of In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and The Worm at the Core on the Role of Death in Life. Sheldon is an American Psychological Society Fellow and a recipient of an American Psychological Association Presidential Citation, a Lifetime Career Award by the International Society for Self and Identity, the Association of Graduate Liberal Studies Programs Annual Faculty Award, and a Career Contribution Award by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Sheldon Solomon, thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody, for having me. I feel like a bit of an interloper here in that my suspicion is that almost everybody that is listening has as much, if not a better background in many of these matters. I am an experimental social psychologist by trade, and we'll talk a little bit about how some of our experimental work might be relevant to the concerns for today. But I, like many of you, am extraordinarily concerned about what's happening in the present moment. And at the risk of sounding hyperbolic and polemical, I do think we are at a unique moment in human history. This is not the first time that societies have been on the brink of collapse, nor is it the first time that democracies in modernity have been threatened. It is, however, the first time that it is happening in the midst of an impending environmental apocalypse that will exponentially magnify some of the underlying psychodynamic characteristics that I think magnify or amplify a propensity to succumb to totalitarian or fascistic tendencies. I'm primarily today wanting to do a classic comic book overview of Hannah Arendt's Origin of Totalitarianism. After World War II, she was trying to understand the Stalins and the Mussolinis and the Hitlers of the world. And I always get stuck on this one particular line in the book when she says the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. That's my view these days when I talk about these matters to more general audiences, is that in the United States, approximately half of the people in America subscribe to a view of the world that is not only factually incorrect, but is 180 degrees opposite of that which they are claiming. And this is not the first time that people have been quite legitimately concerned about the prospects of America succumbing to fascism. I came to Skidmore in 1980. The first book that I read was Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. Fromm came to America to escape Nazi Germany, only to be horrified when he realized that in his mind, Americans were more prone to become fascists at some point. And I like how he said it at the end of Escape from Freedom. There is no greater mistake and no graver danger than not to see that in our own society we're faced with the same phenomenon that is fertile soil for the rise of fascism anywhere. the insignificance and the powerlessness of the individual. And the point that I try to make to general audiences is that this establishes that the tendency to mindlessly adhere to a superficially larger than life leader who claims that they're the only ones that can fix things, that is the hallmark of fascism. And there is an underlying psychodynamic reason why people become attracted to that. Some of you may also have read a crappy novel by Sinclair Lewis in the 1930s, right when Nixon was coming to power. Lewis writes a book about an intellectually and morally bankrupt businessman in America who teams up with the radio and fundamentalist Christians in order to steal an election and then convert America from a democracy to a totalitarian state. All right, let's start and define our terms, noting that we could spend a century quibbling about what's fascism, what's totalitarianism, what's populism. I'm going to go with Jason Stanley, philosopher at Yale, who says, all right, one way of looking at what we might globally describe as fascism is some combination of populism, and that's the domestic divisiveness where we, the people, typically the undereducated rural folks, are set in opposition to them, the hyper-educated cosmopolitan elite who supposedly care not for them. Nativism, that's where the best and fuck the rest, if you'll pardon the expression, a plea for racial or ethnic purity, all of which is typically embedded in the mindless adherence to an authoritarian leader claiming power that is very typically voluntarily afforded to them. Right, and then Stanley goes on and he says, fascist politics aims to separate a population into an us and a them. They transform the population's shared understanding of reality by twisting the language of ideals through propaganda and promoting anti-intellectualism, attacking universities and educational systems that might challenge their ideas. Eventually, fascist politics creates a state of unreality in which conspiracy theories and fake news replace reasoned debate. All right, well, let's look at some fascists historically. And again, I wish we had more time because fascists, more than anything, are the best liars in the world. But here's some fascists saying some things that are actually true. Mussolini, fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power. Think about today, Fox News, Elon Musk, the oil industry in conjunction with former President Donald J. Trump already plotting the takeover of the United States and supplanting democracy with a corporate partnership. Remember Hitler, if you tell a big lie, if you tell a big enough lie and tell it frequently enough, it will be believed. Hitler, after World War I, took up the lie that it was Jews who caused Germany to lose the war. He used it to get himself elected in the 1930s without Russian interference, and that lie persisted for decades, just as the lie that Trump has propagated about the 2020 election will be here long after all of us that are listening today are no longer respiring. And then to the right, we've got, I'll call him Orange Hitler, that's why I'm using orange font here, who just said it. I love the poorly educated. And then we don't even need 1984 or other horrific novels. Just remember that what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what is happening. All right, so let's keep going. And let's just note, again, not to ruin our day, but this is already happening here. So when the book It Can't Happen Here came out, there was a one-sentence review. When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. And I add to that, toting a gun. And then some folks, I hope some of you have heard of this gentleman, Thomas Massie, He is the elected representative, a Republican in Kentucky. And a lot of folks have never heard of him, and that's because he's a moderate Republican. No Jewish space lasers, just 7 members of his family with automatic weapons pleading for Santa Claus to bring them more. And some of you may have seen last November, a public school in Iowa had to apologize because every day they use a famous quote, and they had all of the students stand up and say, "My honor is my loyalty." Ooh, and they didn't really notice that that was a Nazi party edict that was used every day in Hitler's schools. And then I hope some of you have seen the horrific video that was posted a few days ago on former President Trump's true social media platform. It was a video, and at the end, it's like, what's next for America? And they said the creation of a unified Reich. As some of the folks in the earlier panels that I had the pleasure of listening to this morning pointed out, they're not even disguising any of this. Some old timers may remember Herbert Marcuse of yesteryear, who's like, wow, the Russians and the Germans, they need to use propaganda, but Americans are so lazy that we don't even have to disguise what we're doing. They are saying what they're going to do. Project 2025, for those of us that are literate, explains it in quite distinct detail. But just listening to the commercials, I'll be a dictator for a day. We will take revenge over everybody that has challenged us, and etc. All right, so let's get to the psychodynamic point for today, and that is, how does this work? How do fascist leaders use lies, untruth, to advance their interests and to render their followers incapable of discerning falsehoods and making rational decisions? And this was kind of a big part of the fine presentations and discussions on the panels this morning. And that is, to half of us, we look at the world and we're like, wow, how could people not notice what is actually happening? And the point that I like to make is to frame this in terms of contemporary cognitive neuroscience. And some of you may be familiar with the recently deceased Daniel Kahneman. He's the only psychologist to ever win a Nobel Prize, although it was in economics, but it was for making a distinction between 2 neuroanatomically distinct mental systems. So system 1, fast thinking, system 2, slow thinking. Just don't take this by hemispheres. This is not about left and right hemisphere. This is about 2 different simultaneously operative processes. System 1 is fast thinking, automatic, impulsive, and intuitive. This is the way most of us spend most of our waking moments, whether we're aware of it or not. We're on cognitive autopilot. It is fast but prone to error. It works automatically, and ordinarily that's a good thing when it is complemented by system 2, which is slow thinking. That's used for particular problems. It takes effort. It takes exercise. It takes self-control. In other words, it takes effort, attention, and education. It is quite slow, but quite reliable. And my argument today is that, and I wish we had more time for me to describe why ideally both of these systems should be operational in a coordinated fashion. But for our purposes for the moment, I just want to argue that what fascists do, not necessarily consciously, but the effects of the way that they operate ultimately cripples system 2, slow thinking. And in so doing, lobotomizes their followers intellectually, as well as mangling them emotionally. All right, what do we mean by that? I tell folks these days that if they have a couple of hours to take a peek at Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer, written in 1951, one of my favorite books, high school dropout who worked on the docks in San Francisco. And this is the same year as Hannah Arendt with the Origin of Totalitarianism. And Hoffer's like, how could this possibly happen? What's going on? And he offers a distinctly existentially psychodynamic account that jives really well with Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death, and my work is primarily derived from those ideas. But anyway, let's just go with Hoffer. He says, look, there's a psychological impetus for populist movements, and that is citizens that are angry by virtue of insecurity and are in desperate need of something to live for. So let's see existential desperation as the impetus for the formation of attachments to populist/fascist leaders. He goes on and he says they are thus prone to unwavering dedication to a leader who confidently espouses a cause that infuses their lives with a sense of worth and meaning. And I know that these slides are crowded, and I'd be happy to send them to anybody who wants to look at them after today. But very quickly, I just think these are remarkably sentient ideas when he just goes on to say, I don't think these leaders are especially bright. They're certainly not noble, and they are not original. So what do they have in common? Audacity and a joy in defiance, an iron will, a fanatical conviction that he's in possession of the one and only truth, faith in his destiny and luck, a capacity for passionate hatred, contempt for the present, a cunning estimate of human nature, a delight in symbols, an arrogant gesture, complete disregard of others' opinions, single-handed defiance of the world, and some deliberate misrepresentation of facts. All right, what about emotional mangling? Hoffer goes on to say that every mass movement requires an external enemy, that fascist leaders, I call them the alchemists of hate, that what they do is they take the existential insecurities, to be more precise, repressed death anxiety, that they then point out some other individual, either inside or outside of the culture, that they declare the all-encompassing repository of evil, who, if eradicated, would make life on earth as it is purported to be in heaven. And then the intellectual lobotomy part, and that is that all active mass movements strive to interpose a fact-proof screen between the faithful and the realities of the world. Remember, I have argued that what fascists do is to literally disable the capacity of their followers to think rationally. And anyone who has tried to have a discussion with a faithful Trump supporter will note that a fact bounces off them like rainwater cascading off a duck's ass in a hurricane. All right, so real quick, let's do Hitler first, because as you guys know, as psychohistorians, Hitler had a long chunk of years before we got to the Holocaust and things that most of us are quite familiar with. Anyway, Hitler, often described as an egomaniac who only loved himself, known for bottomless mendacity magnified by a slick propaganda machine, so thoroughly untruthful that he could no longer recognize the difference between lies and truth. Let's dwell on this for a moment, because I don't mind pissing some of you guys off. Hitler was a much more cerebral version than is Trump, who is all lizard hindbrain. Hitler understood when he wrote Mein Kampf precisely what he was doing. And what he said, and I'm just summarizing, you can read this, is that, that basically most people would never think of lying in a big way because they would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. There's a reason why most fascists are sociopaths, because they lack the capacity to be ashamed. And then Hitler goes on to say, for the grossly imprudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. These people know only too well how to use falsehood for the basest purposes. All right, real quick, Hitler was a great orator. He planned his rallies like the circus. They were done at night, so people would be in big crowds and tired. He altered the content to his lower middle class, nationalists, ethnic, anti-Semitic people, peppered his speeches with coarse put-downs of hecklers. Hitler increasingly presented himself in messianic terms, promising, and I quote, to make Germany great again. Not in this slide, but he was the first one to say that. He hearkened back to a golden age for the country to paint the present day in hues that were all the darker. Everywhere you look now, there was only decline and decay. And then finally, Hitler knew that propaganda must appeal to the emotions, not to the intellect, in order to reach the lowest mental common denominator amongst the public. Because the understanding of the masses is feeble, he went on, effective propaganda needed to be boiled down to a few slogans that should be persistently repeated until the very last individual has come to grasp the idea that has been put forward. All right, let's switch from Hitler to former President Donald Trump. And let's note that, again, I say this to be annoying or provocative. I tell the folks that I speak to these days to go back and switch the name Trump for every passage that I just read about Hitler. And I would argue respectfully that everything that was said about Trump is equally true about, or everything that I was said about Hitler, equally true about Trump, except for some misrepresentation of facts. There is one thing that is true about Trump, and that he is literally the world's biggest liar. Over 80% of what tumbles out of his oral cavity has nothing whatsoever to do with reality. 2 points here, though, and one is to note that it is existential fear that underlies the attraction of these kinds of leaders. And you know how to read, so I'm not going to waste our time reading Ernest Becker to the right, or Don DeLillo, who read Ernest Becker and then wrote the book White Noise as a result. But let's look at Steve Bannon. We got elected on Drain the Swamp, Lock Her Up, Build a Wall. This was pure anger. Anger and fear is what gets people to the polls. All right, let's keep going. And let's note that on the one hand, I agree with people who say it is not reasonable to always be comparing people with Hitler. On the other hand, I agree with Jason Stanley at Yale, who also points out that it is equally dangerous not to notice commonalities. I hope some of you all are familiar with the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which was written before, it was begun before he was nominated for president, where a group of mental health experts pointed out that it is really dangerous to have a malignantly narcissistic sociopath with a touch of psychosis in the form of paranoia and delusions of grandeur. It's a bad idea to have someone in the most powerful office in the world who is congenitally incapable of admitting defeat, and who in a fit of narcissistic rage would literally be willing to reduce the entire world to physical rubble in order to be able to confidently declare that there was no collusion. Like Hitler, Trump is a malignantly narcissistic sociopath. Like Hitler, Trump is a racist, xenophobic, homophobic, misogynistic individual. Like Hitler, Trump is an expert liar who knows only too well how to use falsehood for the basest purposes. Like Hitler, Trump uses a constant barrage of emotionally charged lies to keep his followers engaged and enraged. All right, Hitler and Trump are not alone here. Try this book if you've got too much free time, where Joseph Abraham points out that when you look throughout history, the Genghis Khans of the world, they're all narcissistic sociopaths. And this has been a consistent historical pattern where the deranged are able to co-opt the allegiance of the average individual through coercion, literally or psychologically, and then go on to wreak a pile of destruction thereafter. But there's one big difference that we need to be aware of, which makes Trump, in my opinion, more dangerous than Hitler, and that's the benefit of 21st century disinformation technology. Again, old timers, I hope some of you remember Marshall McLuhan from yesteryear, the Canadian communications specialist, who said that the medium is the message, that every technology that is developed has unanticipated consequences. Again, I wish we had more time. We can devote an entire conference to the effects of today's form of information technology. But there's 2 points that I want to make very quickly. One is that gone are the days where every American saw the same thing. When Nixon was impeached, 90% of Americans watched the Watergate trials. We saw the same thing. We may not agree about what we saw, but we actually saw the same thing. Now it is a minority of Americans who read newspapers or listen to actual news.
It's true. The
Okay.
ping is 74-36.
Yeah. So most people who get information do so through the internet, and it is the case that Americans are not responding to the same pieces of information, and that contributes to our increasingly fractured and disintegrated society. On top of that is the algorithmic effects of the social media, which serves to polarize us even more. In other words, Americans are seeing different information. It is not symmetrical. Those on the right are seeing information that is 80% wrong. Those on the left are seeing information that, let's say, according to USC School of Communications, is about 20% wrong. All right, well, so what? Well, again, let's get back to Steve Bannon. The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. All right, again, let's just notice no mention of democracy, no mention of policies. Bannon is just channeling the Nazis. Let us capitalize on people's fear, and let's turn it into rage. And then let's barrage the zone with shit in order to ensure that our forebrains are mangled to the point where we are incapable of engaging in rational thought. And so here's a study of a couple of years ago when Trump had over 75 million Twitter subscribers. And the point is that, yeah, that tells his followers what he's thinking. But what this study pointed out is that, more importantly, this also tells them how they're feeling. All right, and back to the Nazis. Accuse the other side of that which you are guilty. That's my point to my neighbors, Saratoga Springs, very Republican town. And my point is, if you want to know what's really happening, whatever former President Trump says, just assume that it is the opposite of that. All right, back to the studies, though. There was a study of millions of Trump supporters. When Trump's angry, they're angry. When Trump's afraid, they're afraid. Moreover, they've become specialists at spreading information through iconic images. Some of you will remember the Jewish star on the left, and the red, that's communist, the money in the back, that's Soros. And this was only up for like 15 minutes, but that was quite sufficient to get it to spread to millions of folks, and it's still in circulation. Some of you may remember Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist, who in 2016 said, yeah, I've seen Trump before. He reminds me of an alpha male chimp. And this is not meant to be insulting. In fact, this is consistent with evolutionary theorists who points out that there are two kinds of leaders in human communities, that there are some leaders and we subscribe to them basically by fear. And then there are other leaders that we adhere to because we admire and respect them by virtue of wisdom. All right, big study that's very important because authoritarian leaders tend to be overbearing, aggressive, and devoid of moral character. Again, people with prestige tend to be the antithesis of that. But what we know from a study of 69 countries with more than 140,000 participants is that under historical threats of economic uncertainty, that increases people's support for dominant leaders, and that this is mediated by participants' psychological sense of a lack of personal control. If we had more time, I would describe over 20 years, 25 years at this point of our research showing that in the United States, that support for charismatic leaders in general, and George W. Bush in 2004, and Donald Trump in 2016, as well as in 2020, are amplified by existential anxieties. When we remind people that they're going to die by asking them, how do you feel about yourself dying? By interviewing them in front of a funeral parlor, by blasting the word death for 28 milliseconds so fast that you can't see anything. Well, Americans in their right state of mind, in a controlled condition, well, they liked John Kerry more than George W. Bush in 2004. But if we reminded them of death first, they liked Bush more than Kerry. In 2016, Americans liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump, except when reminded that they were going to die, and that increased their support for Trump. Ditto for Biden versus Trump in 2020. And so this is what creates what I consider to be just a massively extended Jonestown environment. Rather than drinking the Kool-Aid down there, we got folks drinking the orange Kool-Aid and wearing the red hats up here. And I just find this picture remarkably disturbing. First of all, the uber whiteness, and then the joy of the people who would be delighted if Trump were to grab them by the pussy, the smugness of the MAGA people, the little future fascists here already. This is not the kind of demeanor that I would argue is compatible with a civil discussion in a democracy between people who might agree to disagree in a fashion that would allow some kind of democratic outcome. Anyway,
5 more minutes. 5 more minutes, Sheldon.
Okay. Oh, I got the clock. Yeah, no matter. Let me just finish. And that is that, you can listen to me, Birkenstock, clad, a granola bar chomping Woodstock throwback of yesteryear, but maybe listen to folks who don't have these obvious political tendencies. I like when The Economist, the conservative journal, in England said that Trump is the most dangerous person in the world. He has literally put the world on pause. Putin's waiting in hopes that Trump will be elected so he can co-opt the Ukraine. She and China's waiting so that they can take Taiwan. Netanyahu is waiting in Israel so they can obliterate the people of Gaza so that Jared Kushner can turn it into real estate. My point is that this is a world-altering moment. And so with that in mind, I'll leave you with this thought. Crises there will continue to be in meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small. There's a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration: the need to maintain balance in and among national programs, balance between the private and the public economy, balance between cost and hoped for advantage. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. Down the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. That's my view. That's also the view of former President Dwight Eisenhower, Army dude, Republican. My point is that this is not about politics. This is about the restoration of democracy. One last thought, and I promise you I'll shut up, and that is that if the essence of fascism is lying, how about if we try to undo that along the lines of what Robert Reich proposes in The Common Good? We must not normalize public lying, and we must ensure that every American has sufficient education to differentiate truth from falsehood. All right, let me stop there and thank you all for your attention. Feel free to write to me if you want to see these slides, if you want to see my own papers, both academic and otherwise, that are elaborations of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.